Greetings and welcome. We are in Senior English B. And our objective now for the hour is to introduce you to a very famous poem by a very famous poet, and we are now moving to another romantic author. If you're on page 818, 819, and I hope you are, then you are seeing there the introduction to this poet. His name is Coleridge. Now, what to say about Coleridge? Well, obviously I'm assuming that you've already got dates down from 819, and you can kind of see your dates there. You can see why 1800 is a good working round date for a lot of these poets that we're dealing with. The first thing I want to point out about Coleridge is that Coleridge and Wordsworth are pals. Okay? They're pals. And together they will publish the most famous document of Romantic English poetry, Lyrical Ballads. All right? And Coleridge and Wordsworth together will publish this classic text where you'll maybe recall there's this special essay at the beginning of the second edition of Lyrical Ballads where Wordsworth tries to explain why it is that this poetry he's writing is so different from the poetry that came before. And in the process of doing so, he kind of invents in large measure the elements of romantic poetry. All right? But they're different kind of poets. And in many ways, they had understandings as they got ready to write their poems for Lyrical Ballads that they were going to focus on different kinds of phenomena, we might say, in regards to their poetry. Now to Coleridge himself. Coleridge is an interesting guy. He will be very much about the supernatural. And so we're going to write that down right away. There's a number of different ways to think about Coleridge. One of them has to do with issues of his troubled life, as your biography will point out. We know that probably there was some drug use that was involved in the creation of some of his texts. And in fact, when we get to Rime of the Ancient Mariner, some of my students have said it's almost like a drug trip when you read this poem. And Coleridge would maybe say about that, thank you very much. Now, before we turn to Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which, by the way, is Coleridge's most famous poem, and by the end of our study of Rime of the Ancient Mariner, you're going to know, oh, this is where those films came from that some of you enjoyed as children, Pirates of the Caribbean, and the whole notion of scary ghost ships and the like. All of those kinds of ideas are going to derive from this really famous poem. In fact, I should say to you this way, Rime of the Ancient Mariner may be, in the history of English thought, one of the most famous poems. Certainly far more famous than Tintern Abbey, for example. Everybody knew about this poem because it was a good, scary story, and that's in fact what it is. It's a horror story. It's a scary story. When we get into it, we'll kind of see how that works out. Before I begin, though, I want to just point out to you the notes that you're taking on page 818. Do you see that with me? Again, there's going to be three elements on page 818 that I suggest you really pay attention to as you get ready for the exam. Notice literary analysis. Anything that's bold there will come up on the exam. I can absolutely guarantee that. So you obviously want to be writing down that information about narrative poetry, poetic sound. Of course, you need to know the difference between alliteration, consonants, assonance, and then, of course, the internal rhyme scheme that often gets used as we're looking at this text. So you definitely want to know about that. The reading strategy, the next section, highly recommend that you utilize this as we work through this poem together. And then finally, dude, if it says vocabulary, you can be guaranteed if those words are going to end up on the exam coming here in a little bit. So, highly recommend. You may want to write down these vocab words as well. And again, identify the way they get used in the poem itself. All right. So you may, for example, know these words from sight, but maybe not the way that they're being used inside of this poem. All right? So let's now turn. And we are looking now at page 820, 821. And we're going to set you up now to the study of this classic poem, Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And it's at this point that you can go ahead and set down your pens, because I'm going to give you a little word picture. You will not need to take notes over this. Trust me, you won't forget this introduction to Rime of the Ancient Mariner, okay? How to set this study up for you? Well, how about this? You and two of your pals decide that you are going down to Denver. It's in the summertime. And you are going to go to a tour, a Warped Tour concert down in Denver. Where, if you don't know, this is a large number of bands that will descend on a single location. And for one ticket, you get in to watch all of these bands. And it's in this area that's kind of got, you know, like a big park area where there's chain link fence around it. You got to go through this gate to get in and all of that. Lots and lots of people there. Can't park so easily, so you have to park blocks away. You're running late. You get out of your vehicle, you and your pals, and you're ostensibly jogging towards this area. And as you turn a corner, you literally can hear the first band warming up. You know that it's not going to be long before you're going to have the first performance. And so your buddies are yelling at you, come on, come on, come on, let's go, hurry, hurry, hurry. Got me? And you are hurrying. When out of nowhere, you feel something grab your arm. And it's hard. It's a hard, firm grip on your arm. And you turn and you look. And staring into your face is this homeless guy. This homeless guy. He's got gross, matted hair. He smells really bad. And he looks at you with these intense eyes. Almost like he's ready to freak out on you. And you pull your arm away. You're like, leave me alone. Like that. Right? And then the guy speaks. Looking right in your eyes. And he says, I have to tell you a story. Will you please listen to me? And you're totally freaked. You're totally freaked. Your buddies were in front of you already, and you can see them about 30 yards up. They're about ready to go into the gate, and they're like, dude, come on, come on. And for a reason, and this is important to understand, for a reason you cannot explain, you decide you're going to listen to this guy. You cannot explain why. Later, you will probably say it had something to do with his eyes. He had these intense eyes, almost like he hypnotized me. And I couldn't move. I had this sense that whatever it was he had to tell me was kind of important. So you're like, all right, all right, all right. And he's like, thank you. I need to tell you a story. And you're like, okay, but can you like make it fast? I got a concert to get to. And he starts telling you the story. The story that he tells you is seriously whacked out, as in very, very strange. It is a strange story, but that's not what upsets you. What upsets you is he believes, you can tell this by the way he's telling the story, he believes what he's telling you is true. That's what really freaks you out. The story will be stories about dead people coming back from the dead to be alive again and stuff like that. And as he's telling you this story, you're like, okay, this is like a strange story. But what really freaks you out is, dude, you clearly think what you're telling me is true. Okay? For some reason, though, you cannot get up and walk away, even though you hear the first band now starting to play. For reasons you cannot explain, you are captured, and you listen to his story. His story will change your life. You will never be the same at the end of the story. Later, when your buddies catch up with you, they're like, dude, why didn't you come into Warped Tour to like watch the concert? And all you can do is say, I don't know, I didn't want to go to a concert anymore. What do you mean you didn't want to go? Dude, we've been planning this for like a year. What are you talking about? You didn't? I don't know, it just didn't matter to me. The story this old man will have told you on the streets of Denver will not only change you that moment, but it'll change you the day after that, the week after that, a month after that. This story is not so easy to forget. In other words, it has an effect on you long term. Now, if any part of what I just gave to you helps you, and I think it should, now we can turn to this very twisted poem called The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Let's get a couple of pieces of vocabulary out of the way. What do we mean by rhyme? We just simply mean here a song or a poem or a story. Got me? What do we mean by mariner? And now you are taking notes. Now you are taking notes. I recommend you be writing some intel down. What do we mean by mariner? What is a mariner? Right, a guy that goes on a boat. Right, a guy that goes on a boat. Do you got me? Now, I'm going to be looking at page 821 and some of this background information. Notice Coleridge used dreams. This you'll want to write down. Coleridge used dreams as the basis for many of his good poems. Okay? The Rime of the Ancient Mariner was based on a dream reported by his friend. Starting with the dream as raw material, Coleridge and Wordsworth begin to elaborate on it. Wordsworth suggested that the act that would drive the entire poem was a crime committed at sea. Using this idea in his own lively imagination, Coleridge wrote a poem that has chilled and enthralled audiences to this day. Of course, the margin notes in italics were actually written by Coleridge. So in other words, when you're looking at some of the margin notes and that type of thing, you're actually looking at Coleridge's comments as well, all right? And by the way, I mean the stuff in italics on the left-hand side. Do you see it? On the left-hand side in like the gray area, right? Does everyone see that? Okay. So as you are turning, everything that's on the inside in italics, that's written by Coleridge. The stuff on the right-hand side that you're always familiar with, of course, that's just stuff that's helping you to know how to read this poem, okay? All right, so are we ready to go? So here we go. The easy way now to work with this poem is to simply read noticing parts. Do you see it real quickly? You're going to begin, first of all, with, on page 821, part number 1. Do you see that? Then we're going to go to part number 2 on 824, then part number 3 on 827. Do you see it? So suggestion, real quickly at level 1. Suggestion. I recommend right now, on your annotations, that you write down part 1, skip several lines, part 2, skip several lines, and so on. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look then at these parts to try and figure out what happens in each part. Or, if you've already taken some notes already, as I would hope that you had, then you're maybe working on the other side of the line in-class notes, right? Where you just write down part 1, what happens in part 1, part 2, what happens in part 2. To read Rime of the Ancient Mariner, first we got to figure out level 1, what actually is happening, right? What's going on. And then we'll start working at level 2 and level 3. So as we work now, we're going to ask ourselves simple questions like, what really is going on? Let's go ahead now. Let's turn to 821, and we'll start right away at part 1. Okay? Are you reading with me now? It is an ancient mariner, and he stoppeth one of 3. By thy great beard and glittering eye, now wherefore stoppest thou me? The bridegroom's doors are opened wide, and I am next of kin. The guests are met, the feast is set. Mayest hear the merry din. He holds him with his skinny hand. There was a ship, quoth he. Hold off, unhand me, greybeard loon, spoons. His hand drop he. He holds him with his glittering eye. The wedding guest stood still, and listens like a 3 years child. The mariner hath his will. The wedding guest sat on a stone, he cannot choose but hear. And thus spake on that ancient man, the bright-eyed mariner. All right, let's pause for a second. Again, I'm teaching you how to read. So one of the things that you're going to do as you exegete a text is simply put it in your own words. What have you read to this point? Let's get a little bit of background, make sure we know what we're doing. First of all, we've got a young kid. That's important you write that down. He's young, he's not old. And he's on his way to a wedding where there's going to be a party. He, of course, is related to one of the people being married. There's going to be this great party. He's all excited. He's on his way there to the party. Notice the similarity to my story about Warped Tour in Denver, right? When, out of nowhere, this old man he calls him a loon. Crazy. This old man grabs him by the arm and he says, I want to tell you a story. Notice the first response is, hold off, unhand me. Don't touch me. You're disgusting. An old homeless guy. I got no interest in hearing what you have to say. And yet notice, he holds him with his glittering eye. What does that even mean? Jot down in your notes what that means. If someone holds you with his eye, what does that mean? Staring at you. But keep going.
Continuous eye contact.
A continuous eye contact. Keep going. Yeah. In other words, it's not just that somebody is looking at you, but that you cannot what?
Look away.
You can't look away. Notice it's as if somehow you're caught. He listens, we're told, the young man, like a 3 years child. The mariner hath his will. What does that mean? Write down in your notes what that means. He has his will. What does that mean? He has his will. Right, control of him in some way. In other words, it's as if his body wants to move, but this old man looks at him and controls him in some way. Then we're told the young man, the wedding guest, sits on a stone. He cannot choose but hear. And then the ancient man is going to tell his story. Now, for the rest of the poem, you might want to put this in your notes. For the rest of the poem, all we've got is an old man telling a story. That's all we've got. It's going to be told in parts, but it's just an old man telling a story. It will be one of the more whacked out stories you're ever going to hear. It is a strange story, but nonetheless, that's all he does is tell a story. Every once in a while in the poem, the young man is going to inject a comment, right, to the old man telling the story. But for the majority of this poem now, you're going to get a story about an old sailor who says, many, many years ago, when I was a young man, I went to sea on a ship with a bunch of other sailors, and something happened on that journey. Now, Wordsworth had suggested that it would be centered around a crime. It's interesting what will be constituted a crime in this story, and of course it becomes one of the most famous metaphors in all of English poetry. All right, let's hear the story now. It begins, and if you want in your notes, you can just call this now the story of the old man or the old sailor, and he's just going to tell us what happened. For the most part now, you don't need to take any notes, you just need to read with me, and if this poem does anything right, and I think it does, then it's not a real complicated story. It's a story that you can pretty much figure out as we read. Notice that Coleridge plays the game of 4-line stanzas that are constructed into parts. Do you see that? Right? Do you see it? Okay. Let's take a look now at what he says. The ship was cheered, the harbor clear. Merrily did we drop below the kirk, below the hill, below the lighthouse top. The sun came up on the left, and out of the sea came he, and he shone bright, and on the right went down into the sea, higher and higher every day, till over the mast at noon. The wedding guest here beat his breast, for he heard the loud bassoon. The bride hath paced into the hall, red as a rose is she, nodding their heads before her goes the merry minstrel. The wedding guest, he beat his breast, yet he cannot choose but hear. And thus spake on that ancient man, the bright-eyed mariner. In other words, notice, the young kid's like, have you been around old people? They like to go slow, both the way they drive and the way they tell stories. Have you ever heard an old fart tell a story? Let me tell you about this story. You're just like, Grandpa, come on, let's get it. Can we get to the end of the, right? Old people take their time telling the story. Notice the young guy. He's like, dude, I can hear the music starting. I gotta go. What does it mean he beat his breast? What's that about? Do you have any sense? Yeah, he's frustrated. He's like, come on, hurry up. And yet, interestingly, he doesn't get up and walk away. He sits there. There's going to be something about the look of this guy that captures his imagination, the young man's imagination. And so he's going to sit and he's going to listen. Well, what happens? He continues. By the way, what have we heard already? What's he told him? Once, long ago, I ended up on his ship. We started sailing out to sea. We went far out into the ocean. That's all the further we've gotten. All right? And the young kid's like, dude, seriously? I do not need to hear a story about you on the ocean. I need to go and party. Let me go and party. And yet the old man just keeps telling his story. Notice, I'm on page 823. Okay? Line 41. And now the storm blast came, and he was tyrannous and strong. He struck with his o'ertaking wings and chased us south along. In other words, he says, we hit a storm in the Pacific Ocean and pushed south, further and further south. Or maybe the South Atlantic, moving towards the south, right? With sloping masts and dripping prow, as who pursued with yell and blow, still treads the shadow of his foe and forward bends his head. The ship drove fast, loud roared the blast, and southward we fled. And now there came both mist and snow, and it grew wondrous cold. In other words, he says, we sailed so far south, it got cold. Right, we started to hit the icy areas of the South Pole, going all the way down. Now let's make a point here for your notes. These are ships that have no engines on them. The only way you move one of these big old boats is how? The wind. That is all. The sails, the wind. You can't even row one of these ships. They're way, way too big. These are huge, huge ships. And the only way they move is to have these large poles called masts that go up. And then you have these large sails that are made of cloth. And large numbers of men have to pull these sails up the mast. And then the wind has to blow to move the ship. Now, once you kind of get stuck in certain currents sometimes, it's hard to get out of those currents. And we're told this ship went all the way down south into the mist and snow. Now we're working again. The ice, I'm at line, and now came both mist and snow, and it grew wondrous cold. And ice, mast high, came floating by, as green as emerald. So in other words, these huge what?
Glaciers.
Yeah, huge glaciers or icebergs, right? And you're kind of sailing in between these. Keep going. And through the drifts, the snowy cliffs did send a dismal sheen, nor shapes of men, nor beasts we keen. The ice was all between. The ice was here. The ice was there. The ice was all around. It cracked and growled and roared and howled like noises in a swound. In other words, they get all the way down into this icy, icy South Pole. At length, he tells next, did cross an albatross. Through the fog it came, as if it had been a Christian soul. We hailed it in God's name. Now, two things for your notes. One, let's make sure we know what an albatross is. First of all, we should point out that the oceans of the world are large, large bodies of water. I remember years ago that my girl had never been outside of the United States. And so I said, come on, I'll take you to Hawaii. So we flew to Los Angeles, and we got on a plane, and I said, come on, I'm going to take you to Hawaii. She had never seen the ocean even, right? She grew up in here, right? In the middle of America. And so we get on this plane, and we're flying an airline, Korean Air, that always puts up the speed you're flying at and the distance both you have flown and distance still left to go. Got me? They just put it up there on the screen for you. And we're at 600 miles an hour. We're flying in this large 747. Hours pass. We've been flying for 9 straight hours. And my wife turns to me and says, we've been flying at 600 miles an hour for 9 hours and I still haven't seen any land. And I said, right. That's right. And we still have 3 hours left before we start to hit any land. That's how large the ocean is. That's how large the Pacific Ocean is, right? It's a huge body of water. Flying at 600 miles an hour. So you can imagine what it's like to get out on a boat, sailing with the wind blowing you, yes? And you go out into these bodies of water where you can sail for a very, very long time and see absolutely nothing. However, interestingly, there are these birds that you often will see. They are called albatross. Now, these albatross are very, very strange birds. You may want to take a couple of notes here. The albatross is a very strange bird. He is radically disproportionate. If you want to Google this, it's fascinating to see a picture of them. They're hideous birds. They're not pretty at all. And one of the reasons they're not pretty is because they have no symmetry to them. They have these little tiny bodies, And they have these huge wings, and I mean huge. These wings can, when they're opened, they're unbelievably majestic in the air, but an albatross on the ground looks kind of goofy because it can barely walk. Why? Because the wings are so big, and here's what it does. It gets in the air currents, and it literally just kind of floats with the air currents, and it can stay aloft for days at a time. It can fly thousands and thousands of miles using just air currents that allow for it to kind of move back and forth. We're told, in the middle of nowhere, down in close to the South Pole, he says, all of a sudden this bird shows up. Number 2, I should point out, mariners are like ball players. Sailors are like ball players. They are very superstitious. I mean, very superstitious, okay? Sailors are hyper superstitious. Every little thing has some second and third meaning to it, all right? It reminds me, years and years ago, I coached a ball player. Very superstitious cat. Are you ready for this? In his senior year, he was still playing with a pair of socks that he had never washed. Never washed these socks. He could stand them in the locker room up, and they would stand up. They were, that's gross they were, but he never would wash them. Why? He was superstitious, so he continued to play in these socks. Before a major game, took all his gear home. He goes in to find his special socks that were standing in the corner, literally standing in the corner. They're gone. He says to his mom, Mom, where are those socks? Oh, those things smelled. They were disgusting. I washed them. Oh. He was like, what do you mean you washed them? And she was like, honey, are you kidding me? How many days had you gone with those before you had washed them? And he just got this look on his face. He's like, you're serious? You washed those socks? He, the next day, comes to tell our team how he cannot play. He doesn't have his special socks. This is a senior ball player who doesn't have his special socks. And we're all just like, okay, here's the deal, dude. You're going to have to play in the socks. They're just clean now, but they're still the same sock. No, it's not the same thing. See, superstitious. That's what we mean by superstitious. Mariners or sailors, same way. And so we're going to hear now some of the superstition of a mariner. I'm with you on page 823. At length did cross an albatross. Through the fog it came. As if it had been a Christian soul, we hailed it in God's name. In other words, do they see it as a positive or a negative that this albatross shows up through the fog? Very positive. They see it and they hail it in God's name. It means a good omen, a good sign. Oh, good. Because part of the problem is that once you get down into this kind of weather, your ship can get stuck. The ice can actually form around your ship, and then you're not getting out. You're just stuck there. And then you have to pray that enough warmth comes to start to melt some of this ice, or you'll stay there. And, of course, once your food runs out and your water runs out, you not only freeze to death, but you starve to death at the same time, right? It's going to be an issue. The albatross. It ate the food it ne'er it ate, and round it flew. The ice did split with a thunder fit. The helmsman steered us through. So in other words, they were kind of like iced in, hemmed in. And all of a sudden when the albatross showed up, the ice starts to separate. The helmsman, the driver of the ship, the pilot, is able to steer through. What are these sailors going to think about this bird? They're going to see it as a good luck charm, right? As something very positive. And a good south wind sprung up behind. The albatross did follow, and every day, for food or play, came to the mariners' hello. In mist or cloud, on mast or shroud, it perched for vespers 9, whilst all the night, through fog smoke white, glimmered the white moonshine. So in other words, he says, what? We end up down south, we're in this nasty cold water, the snow, the ice, we kind of think we're going to get stuck. This albatross, this bird shows up, and he kind of shows us the way out, and he continues to kind of go with us. And we hit good wind, and so we started to sail south, out into the South Pacific, and in the process of doing so, all of us liked the bird. We fed it, we called to it. It was always there. In the morning when we got up, there was the bird again, always flying, kind of like a companion. It's at this point that the young kid sitting outside of Warped Tour, outside of the wedding, has had enough. right? Notice. And do you see, you can kind of see there that there's a break. God save the ancient mariner from the fiends that plague thee thus. Why look'st thou so? So the young kid says, well, okay, I don't get it, but why do you have this like strange look on your face? To which now the old man will respond, with my crossbow I shot the albatross. Okay? End of part 1. So let's write down. Now, what happens in part 1 that's going to be significant? Well, yeah, the albatross, that bird that all those sailors thought was a really good thing for them to have, well, that bird gets shot. How shot? Shot how? A crossbow. We all maybe know what that weapon is. Who shoots the bird? It's kind of one of those things where the guy probably looked up as a young kid and went, 5 to 1, I can knock it out of the air while it's flying. And somebody of his went, no way. And he goes, watch this. Wham. And then the bird is dead. Bird is dead. And now our story is going to begin. Now let's talk real quickly in your notes about what's called the doldrums. All right? Let's talk about it. What are the doldrums? Well, in the South Pacific, much of the year, currents run. And once you get in these currents, they're like rivers within the sea. And once you get inside of them, they'll just move your ship. Whether you got wind or not, they'll just move your ship. They actually carry your ship. And of course, there are all kinds of maps that then sailors use to know what time of the year, get in one of these currents, and then you can move, right? The doldrums are a very particular kind of event in the ocean when several things conspire all at the same time to completely still the ocean. The wind's gone. The clouds that would maybe bring wind, gone. The currents, strangely, go away. And all of a sudden, the ocean gets dead still. It literally looks like, and there's lots and lots of stories about what this looks like from guys who got stuck in this. It literally looks like the ocean turns to land. It's blue, but it's so still that literally you feel like you could get out and walk across it. Got me? Now here's the problem. The only way these large ships sail is with wind. You've got no capacity to row, and you've got no machine to make it go. So when you hit the doldrums, what does that mean? You might want to write this down. When you hit the doldrums, what does that mean? Death. It does mean death. It means everybody on that ship goes into conservation mode big time. You literally do nothing. You sit in shadows. Here's part of the problem. The ocean becomes like a mirror. The sun, because there's no clouds, refract right off of that ocean, and it just bakes your ship. Your ship is made of wood. And as the wood begins to bake, and we're talking about intense heat as it's reflecting, right? Obviously, any kind of exertion is going to make you hungry and thirsty. Got me? Now, here's the problem. You got water in the ocean, but you cannot drink it because it's salt water. The only water you can drink is the water you carry with you in barrels. Once the water is gone, it's just a matter of time. And the human body does weird things when it begins to dehydrate over time. The eyes, the lips, the tongue, the eyes and all other kinds of moisture begin to go out of the body. And as that happens, the eyes start shrinking back into the head. As ironically, the tongue, as it's parched, begins to swell. The tongue swells. The mouth begins to be forced open. Your jaws, literally, forced open as the tongue will swell and come out of the mouth and then begin to turn black. It is a hideous kind of transformation the body goes through. There are several records of ships that were discovered that had hit the doldrums, but by the time they had come out of the doldrums, none of the sailors on the ship were strong enough to be able to raise the mast, raise the sail on the mast, and get out. And then these ships arrived, and when they arrived and they saw the men on the ships, they were usually just laying there dying. They didn't recognize them as humans. because their face had changed so much. Of course, your body will begin to shrink, right? It just starts to lose all of its fluids, and it begins to shrink, so that you literally just look like a skeleton with some skin on it. For those of you who like your zombie movies, the portrayal of zombies often will play the game of Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and the descriptions you're about to hear of having all kinds of strange looking, you're dead, you look dead, but you're not dead yet, because your body is still, the heart is still beating, but just barely. This is called the doldrums. The old man's going to tell us, right after I kill the bird, we hit the doldrums, and we ain't go nowhere. Water everywhere, he's going to tell us, yet none to drink. Okay? Let's take a look at it. Well, I'm kind of at the end, aren't I? Let's come back tomorrow, and we're going to pick up with part 2. My assumption is that you're going to read on your own the rest of Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and then we'll come back tomorrow to have some converse. Thank you.